The termination letter had Julian Cade's name spelled correctly. That was the only part of it that was accurate. Pattern of conduct inconsistent with company standards. Preston Voss read the sentence out loud anyway, as if Julian couldn't read it himself, as if the words needed a witness besides the paper they were printed on. He did not look up while he spoke. He had learned, over 4 years of climbing toward the VP of Operations title on Renner Precision Manufacturing's letterhead, that looking up was where the trouble started. Julian sat across the small conference table with his hands flat on his knees. 9 years on the floor. 6 as a machinist, 3 as line supervisor. He had trained half the people currently pretending not to watch through the interior window of Voss's borrowed office. You bypassed a documented safety protocol on March the 4th, Voss said, twice in April, and you were 40 minutes late to your shift on the 9th. I filed a report on March the 4th, Julian said. I didn't bypass anything. I wrote down what I found. Voss closed the folder. That's not what the file says. Dale from security waited outside the glass with a banker's box already folded flat under one arm, the posture of a man who had done this enough times to know exactly how long it would take. It took 4 minutes. Julian carried his box past the press lines he had walked 1,000 times, past Rodney Ferris, who still wore a compression glove on his right hand from an accident 6 weeks earlier, past people who wanted to say something and understood, correctly, that saying it would cost them their own jobs. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long moment before he remembered that Wren had a 1:15 appointment at Ridgeline Memorial to get her cast checked. He drove there anyway. There wasn't anywhere else that made sense to go. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button, subscribe to Hidden Ledger, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. He held her hand until the fear stopped mattering. He had no idea what she controlled. Keep watching. Julian had come to Renner Precision at 26, 3 years married, with a wife who worked front desk at a dental office, and a habit of humming while she drove. May Cade died 4 years later. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late for the doctors to make many promises, and keeping the promises she could until the end. Renner Precision had not fired him during those 18 months, and he had never forgotten it. His supervisor at the time, a man long since retired, had quietly rearranged the shift schedule around chemo appointments, without ever putting anything in writing that could be pointed to later. Julian had paid that back the only way he knew how. He showed up early, he trained the new hires without complaint, and when something on the floor looked wrong, he said so. That habit was what put him in Voss's crosshairs. 6 weeks before the termination, Rodney Ferris caught his hand in the die on press line 4. The interlock that should have stopped the press mid-cycle had been manually overridden 3 days earlier, on Voss's direct order, to shave 40 seconds off each cycle and hit a rush shipment deadline for a client Voss cared more about impressing than he cared about the guardrail that protected it. Julian filed the incident report the same afternoon. He wrote it plainly. The interlock bypass, the date it had been ordered, the injury that followed. He handed it to HR himself instead of routing it through Voss, because he had already learned enough about Voss to know where paperwork tended to disappear. It disappeared anyway. Under review, HR told him, 3 separate times, over 3 separate weeks. The write-up started 12 days later. A missed breakroom sign-off, a parts count discrepancy that had never once been flagged in 9 years. The March the 4th incident report itself, somehow reframed as evidence against him rather than the man who had ordered the bypass. Julian understood what was happening before the 4th write-up landed. He kept working anyway, because Wren needed the health insurance more than he needed to win an argument he could feel closing around him like a fist. He lost that argument on a Tuesday morning, in a borrowed office, in 4 minutes. Ridgeline Memorial's emergency department was running 2 nurses short and 1 trauma bay over capacity. A 5-car pileup on the county highway, having eaten every spare set of hands since 8 that morning. The orthopedic clinic upstairs had rerouted its overflow through the ER, which was how Julian ended up in a molded plastic chair in a hallway with Wren, waiting for someone to glance at a cast that had, by every appearance, healed just fine. Wren colored a dinosaur with a crayon that kept skipping. Julian sat with the banker's box still in his truck and the termination letter folded into a shape too small for its actual weight, and tried to work out how he was going to explain any of this to a 7-year-old without frightening her. He noticed the old woman before anyone official seemed to. She was in a gurney bay 2 doors down, gown tied wrong at the shoulder, an oxygen line taped under her nose, and no one beside her. She kept trying to sit up. A monitor kept beeping in a way that made the nurses further down the hall move faster without actually reaching her any sooner. "Ma'am, I need you to lie back," a passing text said, already gone before the sentence finished. The woman's eyes found Julian's through the gap in the curtain. Sharp eyes, frightened ones. "Is someone coming?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the sound a person makes when they already suspect the answer. Julian looked at Wren, who was absorbed in her dinosaur, and told her to stay put. Then he stood up and walked into the bay like he had every right to be there, because some instinct older than 9 years at Renner Precision told him that a person alone and afraid did not need to hear the word protocol right then. He had sat in enough hospital chairs holding May's hand to know exactly what the silence before a surgery sounded like from the inside. "I'm here," he said. He didn't know her name yet. It didn't seem to matter. A nurse rounded the curtain a moment later. Badge reading D. Okoye, arms full of a tablet and a blood pressure cuff, and the particular exhaustion of someone 6 hours into a shift built for 4. She took in the scene in under 2 seconds. "You family?" "No," Julian said. "She doesn't have anyone here right now." Denise Okoye looked at him, looked at the monitor, looked at the empty hallway behind her where no relief was coming anytime soon. "If she wants you here, be here," she said. "I don't have hands to spare for hand-holding today, and God knows she needs it." She was already moving to the next task before she finished the sentence. The old woman's grip found Julian's hand before he offered it. "Margaret," she said. "That's my name, in case anyone asks, and you'd like to have an answer ready." "Julian." "Well, Julian, I don't suppose you know anything about gallbladders." "Not a thing. Neither did I, 20 minutes ago." Her laugh cracked in the middle. "Now apparently, I know rather a lot." The surgeon came through with the flat, practiced calm of someone who explained the same procedure 40 times a month. Emergency cholecystectomy. Nothing that should be complicated. At her age, it carried more risk than it would have 30 years earlier. And no, there wasn't time to wait for family to be located and reached. A consent form needed a witness signature from whoever was present. Julian signed it. He wrote his name the way he always did, small and even, Julian Cade, in the line marked support person, without thinking twice about what that piece of paper might mean to anyone later. They let him walk with the gurney as far as the pre-op doors. Margaret's hand did not loosen the whole way down the hall. "My assistant is stuck on the highway," she said, mostly to the ceiling. "There was an accident. Someone told me that. I don't remember who. Same accident that's kept this whole floor running behind all day," Julian said. "He'll get here." "You don't know that." "No," Julian admitted. But it sounded like the thing to say. She turned her head and actually smiled at that. The first real one since he'd walked into her bay. Honesty with a delay. "I respect that. My wife used to say I was better at honesty than timing." "Used to?" She passed. "A few years back." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its brittle edge. "Then you already know what this feels like. The waiting part." "I know the waiting part," Julian said. "I don't know the gallbladder part." At the pre-op doors, a nurse told him this was as far as he could go. Margaret's hand tightened once, hard, before she let it drop. "Will you still be here?" Julian glanced back down the hall toward the plastic chair where Wren sat, cast propped on her knee, watching him with the patient seriousness of a child who has learned that some days simply run long. "I'll be here," he said. He sat back down beside his daughter. She leaned her head against his arm without looking up from the dinosaur. "Who was that lady?" "Somebody who needed somebody today," Julian said, which was true, and simpler than anything else he could have offered. If this story has found its way to you, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Ledger and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. Margaret came out of recovery groggy and asking, in a voice thick with anesthesia, for the young man from the hallway. A nurse relayed this up the chain with some confusion, since no chart had a name for him beyond a signature on a consent form. It was Harold Pruitt, arriving 40 minutes later than he should have and visibly rattled, who finally supplied the context the staff had been missing. "Her name is Margaret Renner," he told the charge nurse, showing his own identification along with hers. "I'm her assistant. I've been trying to reach this hospital for 2 hours. Denise Okoye, refilling a supply cart nearby, caught the surname without meaning to. She didn't think much of it. Renner wasn't an unusual name, and she had a dozen other things demanding her attention. Julian, 3 chairs down with Ren asleep against his shoulder, heard it differently. It landed somewhere behind his ribs and stayed there, refusing to resolve into either coincidence or catastrophe. Renner. It was a common enough word that it could mean nothing. It could also mean everything, and he had no way yet to know which. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and Margaret was still sedated, and Harold was already deep in conversation with an administrator about private rooms and specialists to be flown in if needed, and none of it seemed like Julian's business to interrupt. 50 miles away, word had already started moving through Renner Precision's front office that the chair emerita had been hospitalized. It moved the way rumors move in a building full of people trained to read the mood of leadership before they read anything else. Preston Voss heard it secondhand from a purchasing manager and felt something cold settle low in his stomach, though he could not, at first, have explained why a hospitalized elderly board member should worry him at all. He called the hospital that evening under the pretense of sending flowers on behalf of the company. He was told, politely and firmly, that Mrs. Renner was resting and not taking calls. He hung up and sat very still at his desk for several minutes. That same evening, Rodney Ferris showed up at Julian's apartment with a 6-pack he didn't open and a look on his face that said he'd been carrying something around all day. "I heard you got let go," he said. "I should have come forward sooner. About the interlock. About what Voss told me not to say. You've got a family too, Rodney. Doesn't make it right." Rodney sat down heavy on the porch step. "There's more to it than the guardrail, Julian. I saw a budget memo on a printer in the break room by mistake, back in February. Safety upgrade money, meant for all 3 press lines. 186,000 and change, routed into some regional bonus pool instead. Voss's name was on the approval line." Julian said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Write that down. Everything you remember, just in case it ever matters to somebody who can do something about it." He had no idea, saying it, how soon that somebody would exist. Margaret Renner recovered in a private room for 4 days, sharper each morning, and increasingly insistent about the man who had held her hand through the worst hour of a very long life. Harold finally tracked down the name from her chart, Julian Cade. A quick call to the plant's HR department, framed as a routine follow-up, confirmed the employer. It also confirmed, almost as an afterthought from a nervous HR coordinator eager to seem helpful, that Mr. Cade had been terminated that same Tuesday morning. Margaret asked for his personnel file directly, through her own legal counsel rather than through Voss's office, and had it delivered to her hospital room within the hour. She read it twice. The first read, she was looking for the man she remembered from the hallway. The second read, she was looking for something else entirely, and she found it in the timeline. March the 4th, a safety incident report filed by Julian Cade, describing an unauthorized interlock bypass on press line 4. March the 16th, the first disciplinary write-up against Julian Cade, for an infraction that had never once appeared in 9 prior years of otherwise clean reviews. She had Harold pull the capital expenditure records for the safety upgrade line item next. $186,400. Budgeted for guard replacements across 3 press lines. Redirected under Preston Voss's authorization into what the ledger called a regional efficiency incentive pool. A pool that, cross-referenced against the bonus disbursement schedule, had paid out most generously to Preston Voss himself. Margaret set the folder down on the hospital blanket and sat with it for a long while. The man who had signed her consent form because no one else was there. The man whose signature sat on a hospital chart 2 floors below the boardroom that, technically, she still controlled 61% of. She had spent 4 days grateful to a stranger. She had not yet understood that the stranger's fate had been sitting inside her own company's paperwork the entire time, waiting for someone with the authority to open it. "Harold," she said, "get me the board's emergency contact list and find out where Mr. Cade lives. I owe him a conversation he doesn't yet know is coming." The board call convened 9 days after Margaret's surgery, sooner than protocol usually allowed. Called at her personal request as majority shareholder, and therefore not a request anyone declined. Preston Voss was asked to attend in person. He arrived expecting a routine operations review. He found Margaret Renner seated at the head of the table, thinner than the last time he'd seen her, a folder in front of her that he recognized without being told what was inside it. "Explain the interlock bypass on press line 4, she said. No preamble. Voss's explanation ran through throughput targets and client deadlines and standard industry practice, each sentence a little more brittle than the last, until Margaret slid the safety incident report across the table, dated and signed by Julian Cade, followed by the budget memo Rodney Ferris had never forgotten. $186,000, she said, meant for the guardrails that would have kept a man's hand out of a die press. Routed into a pool that paid your bonus. That fund allocation was approved through standard channels. It was approved by you, for you, after a man was injured because you overrode a safety protocol to save 40 seconds. Margaret's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. And when an employee did exactly what this company claims to want from its people, he documented it and reported it through the proper channel. You spent 6 weeks building a paper case to fire him before it could reach me. The room was silent long enough that the silence itself became the verdict. Preston Voss was terminated for cause that afternoon. His conduct referred for regulatory review. His severance forfeited under the terms of the very policy he had spent years enforcing against everyone beneath him. He left the building the way Julian had left it 9 days earlier, escorted, carrying less than he'd arrived with. Julian was reinstated the following morning, with full back pay and a formal written apology that named, specifically, the retaliation that had occurred. Margaret created a new position that reported directly to the board rather than through regional operations. Director of Floor Safety Compliance. Rodney Ferris's medical costs, including a surgery his insurance had balked at covering in full, were paid retroactively and in full. Every interlock across all 3 press lines was inspected, restored, and placed under a reporting system that bypassed regional management entirely. Denise Okoye's ER unit received, a few weeks later, an anonymous foundation grant covering 2 additional full-time nursing positions and new patient monitoring equipment for the department, with a note attached that read only, "For the day you had no hands to spare, and gave one anyway." Denise never learned who sent it. She had a fairly good guess. Julian's new office was smaller than Voss's had been and faced the floor instead of the parking lot, which he preferred. He kept Rodney's handwritten account of the budget memo in the top drawer, not because he needed it anymore, but because some things were worth remembering exactly as they'd happened. Margaret visited the plant on the first Friday of most months now, unannounced, dressed plainly enough that new hires sometimes didn't recognize her. She and Julian had fallen into an easy, unhurried kind of friendship, the sort built less on gratitude than on the fact that they had once sat together in the worst hour of each other's year, and neither of them had needed the other to explain why it mattered. Wren's cast came off in June. She kept the dinosaur drawing from that day, taped inside her closet door, the crayon skips and all, because her father had told her it was the last thing she drew before everything got better, and she liked having proof of that. On a Friday afternoon in early autumn, Margaret stopped by the plant floor while Wren was there for a school half-day, sitting at the edge of Julian's new office doing homework at his desk. Margaret leaned against the doorframe and asked her, the way she always did, whether her father was behaving himself. Wren considered the question with the seriousness of someone who took her role as chief informant on this matter very seriously. "He still won't let me have dessert before dinner," she said, "but he held your hand when nobody else would, so I guess that evens out. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are ready to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed to Hidden Ledger yet, come find us. Every story we tell ends the same way. Every account settles. We think you're glad it does too.